Hi, everybody, and welcome to the next Gen3 Community Forum. Today, we're focused on data modeling in Gen3 Data Commons. I'm Michael Fitzsimons, Director of Research and Outreach at the Center for Translational Data Science at the University of Chicago. Today, so these forum events are brought to you by or supported by the Australian Biocommons, the New Zealand eScience Infrastructure, University of Chicago, CTDS, and Open Commons Consortium. So in addition to them, we also have a speaker today from the Data for the Common Good from the University of Chicago. Next slide. So today, we're going to introduce Gen3 data models, which I think is an interesting topic, and we have some interesting speakers to give you their perspective on how they have gone about creating data dictionaries, what tools they've developed, what perspectives they have from their different projects. I think you'll see a lot of interesting content today. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. You're going to be muted by default, so please remain muted until the end of the session. You can raise your hand and we'll unmute you if you want to ask a question verbally. You're free to ask questions throughout in the chat. Typically, we'll handle them at the end. If a speaker would like, they can maybe address one quick question in their session, but I want to make sure we have time to get through everybody's presentations. The slides and recording will be available in the coming days. Bob, do you have any thing you want to say before we get started?
Yeah, I just want to welcome everyone. And I just want to emphasize the interest in everyone working on Gen3 to expand the community and to work with everyone on the line and to sort of, make it easier for anyone anywhere building a Gen3 Commons or interoperating with Gen3 services to get all the information they need and to contribute to the community and to contribute to the open source repository and to contribute to the Gen3 roadmap. So these meetings are very important. Please tell others about them and please send us your feedback. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Bob. Okay, with that, I'm going to just spend a few minutes giving you an introduction to Gen3 data models, which hopefully will, for those of you who are not as familiar with it, will give you a little background that might help you with the rest of the presentations. Next slide. Okay, great. So really briefly, I'm going to explain what is a data model versus a data dictionary, the structure of a Gen3 data model, and then just a couple of tips for creating a Gen3 data model. Next slide. So I am certainly guilty of using the term data dictionary and data model interchangeably. Maybe our other speakers are more precise than I am, but just to give you a sense of how they're a little bit different. So the data dictionary at the basic level defines and describes how research data sets are represented in a database. It harmonizes and aligns term definitions from different data sources. Basically, dictionaries get everyone on the same page. I'll show you briefly how you define nodes and properties. It helps to avoid inconsistencies in the data reporting and users of the data. It's a lot easier to understand if we're all using the same terminology. It makes data easier to find, subset, and analyze. There's a trivial example on the right where I'm showing how different projects may use different terminology for an index date, which a lot of projects use a day of zero, which is maybe a positive test of some sort or an enrollment in a study. Everything's relative to that. And so it's important to make sure you're using the same term so when people are looking at your data, they understand and can subset it correctly. Next page. Or next slide. Data model basically is the higher level organization. If a data dictionary is writing down all of the nodes and properties and permissible values, a data model for Gen3 in particular is this higher level graph structure, this higher organization. And this is what, excuse me, this enables Gen3 services to submit index and query data when this data model is generated. Next slide. So to just dig into the data model a bit more in Gen3, this is a graph-like relational model consisting of interrelated nodes that are stored certain related properties. So you can see on the right how all of the nodes are related. On the left is a data dictionary viewer of a particular node that lists properties and permissible values, or what types of answers you can give. Some of them you can give integers, some of them you can give strings, etc. You're allowed in Gen3 to restrict how data is submitted. And this is really important for when data users come along. It makes it much more easier to analyze the data. Next slide. So I'm not going to get into these details very much about submitting a data dictionary. We have a lot of documentation online that's prepared by our user and data services team. But briefly, the data model is a JSON created by schemas in a YAML format. So each of these nodes is an individual YAML file that lives in GitHub and can be modified by comments operators. Some important details is you need, in terms of what you need to include is a node ID. You can put a category, a description of the node, and then the list of links. So maybe a subject has different visits to a doctor or follow-up studies or samples that were taken from it. These are why the graph-like structure is very useful, is that you can really associate certain data with each other. You can have a list of required properties and then a list of other properties. Next slide. So just a couple very short tips for creating a Gen3 data model. And the video next by Chris Meyer is going to go into these in a little more detail. But just to start off, it's really important to collect use cases for your data commons when you're creating your data model. Not all data needs to be added into the graph data model. Harmonization takes time and effort. And so you have to weigh that effort with what value is acquired by doing so. So it is allowed and advisable in some cases to have flat files that you can download that includes clinical data or biospecimen data. When you're adding content to the data model, you're really thinking about how will this improve data users' experience? Are they able to create new or interesting cohorts based on what data you have put in the data model? So the examples are, we want to make sure that there are certain clinical properties that are viewable in the interface and via the API, so you can make cohorts. You may want to add certain data on biospecimen nodes. So these are maybe a tumor sample or a blood draw or something like that, where you need to include some details there that allow you to choose which patients you're interested in. And then finally, you could put specific file type information on files so that you could say download only BAM files or download only DICOM images, etc. Next slide. I think another thing I would recommend is review existing data model examples. Don't start from scratch. CTDS has made a lot of data models and all of them are publicly available. So I think those are good resources. The other commons that you'll hear about today may also have their dictionaries available. But certainly I would take a look before creating one, because there's a lot of different projects, that focus on imaging or genomics or proteomics. And so there might be something out there that can, get you 75% of the way there. Next slide. And then finally, I just wanted to give a plug to referencing external vocabularies. This is certainly not a requirement when you create a data dictionary, but it does facilitate data standardization. So it might be that if you do refer to an external vocabulary, I gave two examples, NCIT or LOINC, this just allows the data users to really know what you mean and to compare to other studies that might live somewhere else to make sure they're looking at the same information. Okay, that's really it for my brief introduction. So I'm gonna turn it over to the next speaker, which is a video. Unfortunately, Chris Meyer was not able to make it today, but he put together a great video that's going to explain the evolution of the MIDRIC data model. I cannot hear the audio. I'm assuming others cannot hear the audio either.
I'll discuss some topics related to creating and maintaining a Gen3 data model using the MIDRIC data commons as an example. The Medical Imaging Data Resource Center, or MIDRIC, is a data commons powered by the Gen3 platform and sponsored by the National Institute of Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering. The goal of MIDRIC is to share expertly curated medical images and associated clinical data for the purposes of training and testing AI or machine learning algorithms, with the ultimate aim of improving patient outcomes through advancing medical science. MIDRIC is especially focused on the detection, diagnosis, monitoring, and prognosis of COVID-19. The data hosted in the MIDRIC data commons ranges from digital X-rays, CT scans, and MRI images to longitudinal clinical data, including patient demographics and medical history records like diagnosis, vaccination, medication, treatment, and procedure data. This data flows into the MIDRIC data commons from many different contributing sites across the United States. Given the data in MIDRIC originate from different sources, they need to be harmonized through the use of a data model, which aligns term definitions across sources and defines how different types of data relate to one another. Also, when data come from many sources, as they do in MIDRIC, the structure and dictionary of the data model often need to be decided by a committee, consisting of representatives from the different contributing organizations, subject matter experts, and the data commons sponsors and operators. So now I'll tell the story of how we created and maintained the data model for the MIDRIC project in order to impart any lessons and wisdom we've learned along the way. The first lesson I've learned from creating several new data models, with MIDRIC being the most recent, is to not reinvent the wheel. That is, you should always try to borrow and modify what you can. Since a Gen3 data model is essentially a collection of nodes that relate to one another through links, it's relatively easy to pick and choose nodes from existing data models that approximate what you need, and then stitch them together into something new. Many biomedical data models will be patient-centric, meaning that most other types of data in the data model ultimately relate back to a set cohort of patients enrolled in a study. This is in fact the case for MIDRIC, so when the first draft of the MIDRIC data model was created, I borrowed the study and subject nodes from an existing data model like the BloodPack data model, which was one of the first Gen3 data models. I also threw in the catch-all supplementary file node, which simply links up to the study node for capturing any file related to the study that doesn't fit neatly into another category. Some of the terminology for the clinical portion of the data model has been adapted from the OMOP common data model, including the visit, condition, medication, procedure, and measurement nodes. The properties on those nodes have been heavily focused on capturing COVID-19 related data, including common COVID-19 testing, vaccination, and treatment information, in addition to any basic demographic data provided by the hospitals. Finally, the imaging portion of the data model was created following the DICOM standard hierarchy of subject to imaging study to imaging series to image instance. In my opinion, the single most important factor when making decisions about a new data model is the functionality. Before we put pen to paper, we should be asking the basic question, what is the purpose of the data model? Which also requires you to ask who will be using the data model and for what purpose. So what is the purpose of the data model? In one word, the purpose of the data model is search. A well-designed data model simply allows researchers to pinpoint the specific data they're looking for across the entire collection of studies, datasets, publications, or clinical trials in a data resource. So again, always come back to this question when making decisions about the structure and content of your data model. Will this change make it easier for users to search across different datasets? because that's the purpose of the data model. The data model allows you to harmonize data sets that come from different sources by defining common variables. Harmonization of data sets from different sources is a time-intensive project, and the only reason to put in all that effort is to empower researchers to run searches over the harmonized data sets in order to build novel cohorts. Data modeling committees will often look at sample data and ask, do we need to define this variable of a data set? And to ask is, does adding this variable to the data model enhance the power of queries that run over all the data sets in our data resource? That is, does adding this variable to the data model assist our users in building novel cohorts for research? Does it help users weed out data they don't want, or help them identify the proper samples for their analysis out of the millions of other samples in the data resource? If the answer to these questions is yes, then we should add the variable to the data model to facilitate queries and cohort building across datasets. If the answer is no, then the variable is best provided in a supplementary file unique to that project. In the case of MIDRC's initial data model, we used some sample datasets from the Cancer Imaging Archive, or TCIA, as a starting point. Having sample data to load into the first draft of your data model is critical, although the data model shouldn't necessarily be built around the sample dataset. Any idiosyncrasies of the sample datasets can be left out and provided in supplementary files. For example, in one of the TCIA datasets that we used as sample data for the initial MIDRC data model, the clinical data includes the patient's latest BMI measurement and whether the patient has ever had chickenpox. These measurements aren't available in any other MIDRC dataset, and there are no plans to collect that information. So adding these variables to the data model would add very little value, as queries of those variables would only empower users to select subsets of patients from that single dataset. Alternatively, this data can be provided as a file to download if a researcher wants to reanalyze that specific study. So once we had some good sample data and a first draft of the MIDRC data model that accommodates those data, it was time to deploy it. First, because the MIDRC data model is a collaborative project, a GitHub repository was created to house the data model files. Some automation is set up in GitHub such that when the code is tagged and released, the YAML schemas that form the data model are converted to a single dictionary file in JSON format, and this JSON is uploaded to a publicly accessible location in the cloud. In MIDRC, we have a staging environment where changes to the data commons services, portal configuration, and data are staged for review prior to releasing to the production website. To get the new data dictionary in the staging environment, we simply update the dictionary URL field in the manifest JSON for the staging environment. Finally, once the portal manifest file is updated with the new dictionary URL, Gen3 services that use the data model need to be rolled, and that includes the Sheepdog service that handles data import and export, the Peregrine service that handles GraphQL queries, and the data portal service itself, which includes the dictionary viewer, query builder, and data submission pages. Once the new deployments of these services are up, the new data model is ready to be used for data import, export, and queries. As the MIDRC Data Commons operators, the CTDS team at the University of Chicago handles the implementation and deployment of changes to the MIDRC data model. But decisions about what changes need to be made take place via a data modeling committee called DSIT, or the Data Standards and Information Technology Working Group. This committee consists of radiology experts, including various project sponsors, partners, and those from the organizations contributing imaging data to MIDRC. Once there's verbal agreement in meetings as to what changes need to be made, the changes are staged in the MIDRC staging environment and sent out for review to the entire group. After review, the changes are voted on by a small group of representatives from each organization participating in the data modeling committee. Once the vote is complete and no additional changes have been requested, the data model is moved to the production site. Inevitably, the first draft of the data model will not be capable of capturing all data types that a data commons will want to harmonize, and additional nodes and properties will need to be added. As mentioned previously, addition of nodes and properties is considered a non-breaking change because those changes don't invalidate the existing data. However, sometimes a breaking change is necessary. A breaking change is a change that invalidates previous data and will require a data migration from the old dictionary format to the new format. An example of a large breaking change that required MIDRC to undergo a large data migration was moving from indexing image instances to indexing only zipped imaging series. This was primarily as some imaging series contain many hundreds of smaller image slices that are to be interpreted together as a three-dimensional stack of images. This was a large effort as it changed both the structure of the data model as well as the index data files themselves. First, image instance data files were packaged into series-level zip files and indexed. Once the files were zipped and indexed, we needed to update the data dictionary, adding in the new series file nodes and removing the image instance nodes. So an intermediate dictionary version was created that contained both the image instance nodes that were to be removed later and the new imaging series file nodes. Having both the old and new nodes present in the dictionary at the same time as an to A-B to B migration strategy. Once the data in its new format was completely ingested and made searchable and accessible to users, the old nodes and properties were removed from the data model, and the final data dictionary update was deployed. Another data migration issue that the Midric team encountered was ages being provided that were outside the acceptable range. According to HIPAA rules, ages of 90 and above should be binned together into a single category to avoid re-identification of patients. In order to prevent accidental ingestion of specific age values over 89 years, a minimum and maximum value of 0 and 89 were applied to the age at imaging variable and the imaging study node of the data model. While minimum and maximum values can be used to restrict numbers and integers to a range of acceptable values, strings can be restricted by either making them enumerations, which only accept a list of values, or forcing strings to match a regular expression. An example of using regular expressions is the UUID property of the data dictionary, which restricts values to the standard 128-bit UUID format. Finally, I'd like to talk a bit about enhancing the searchability of data through the addition of derived elements to the data model. In Midric and many other data commons with de-identified medical data, exact dates are forbidden by HIPAA rules. However, since Midric does store longitudinal data, that is, data with a temporal element, we use the concept of temporal events relative to an index event. For example, if the index event is the date a patient first received a COVID-19 test result, that event is said to occur at day 0. If the patient has another COVID-19 test 5 days later, that event is said to occur at day 5, and an MRI imaging study of their lungs performed 2 weeks later occurs at day 14. If an event occurred before the index event of their first COVID test, let's say they received a COVID vaccination 3 months prior to their first COVID test, the date they received their medication is said to be day -90, because we're moving backwards in time from the index event. This sort of setup is nice for constructing timelines for individual patients. However, since patients across different data sets may have different index events, it presents a challenge to users trying to query the data to build a cohort based on temporal events. For example, say a researcher wanted to access all imaging studies that occurred within 1 week of a positive COVID test. This simple use case is impossible to capture with a single query, since it must calculate the difference between the values of 2 different properties on 2 different nodes, both the days to COVID test property on the measurement node and the days to study property on the imaging study node. So what we've done in Midric is to calculate the difference in time between every COVID test and every imaging study for each patient, and we store that information in 2 additional properties in the data model on the imaging study node: days from study to positive COVID test and days from study to negative COVID test. Using one of these 2 derived properties, users can now select a time range to search for all imaging studies that occurred within a defined window of time from a positive or negative COVID test. Another example of derived properties we've added to the dictionary to support user queries is mapping of imaging study descriptions to a third-party ontology called the LOINC playbook. The Midric Data Quality and Harmonization Working Group wanted to keep the original study descriptions available for queries while also standardizing them to facilitate simpler queries for cohort building. For example, a researcher interested in accessing all CT imaging studies of the chest without contrast would find that there are 24 different imaging study descriptions matching those criteria, with some using the word without, and others using an abbreviation WO, and many other variations with alternative or additional text. To harmonize these study descriptions, the Data Quality and Harmonization Working Group created a study description mapping file that maps the original imaging study descriptions, modalities, and body parts to the corresponding standard LOINC terms, which were added to the data model as properties on the imaging study node. Using this mapping file, over 97% of the MIDRIC imaging studies were mapped to standard LOINC terms for modality, contrast, body part, and study description. This way, instead of requiring a researcher to sort through the over 1,100 unique study descriptions and select the ones that seem to match CT chest without contrast, they can instead select the one corresponding LOINC study description from amongst the 74 harmonized options.
Thank you for listening to this video detailing the evolution of the MIDRIC data model. I hope it served as food for thought and assists you in creating and maintaining your own Gen3 data models. I look forward to interacting with you in our Gen3 community Slack channel and at future Gen3 events. If you have any questions about the MIDRIC data model, please reach out to me at cgmeyer@uchicago.edu or email the MIDRIC help desk at midric-support@datacommons.io. Finally, to learn more about the Gen3 platform for creating data resources, visit us at gen3.org. Happy data wrangling!
Thanks to Chris for putting that together. I hope there was some interesting, helpful information in there. Chris himself has created quite a few data models and data dictionaries, so has a wealth of experience there.
Hi, my name is Chris Meyer, and I lead the User and Data Services team here at the
Great. Okay, so our next speaker is Marian Shadbolt, and she's going to speak about streamlining Gen3 data dictionaries, Python tools, and Google Sheets for simple, automated, and efficient dictionary development. Welcome, Marian.
Thanks, Michael. I think we can go to the next slide. Yeah, I wanted to thank the committee for selecting me to give this talk today, and thanks for all the introductory text. It'll be really helpful to what I'm going to explain today. And I'm presenting this on behalf of myself and Uwe Winter and everyone who's worked on this project. Uwe did a lot of the technical work underlying what I'm presenting today. Next slide. So just as what I'm going to be talking about, I'll give you a bit of context and overview of our project, talk about how we went about harmonizing our objects, fields, and data types, and then the way we went about kind of compiling the dictionary, being able to visualize that to get an idea of the structure, and then how we kind of put that into the portal and again, visualize that as kind of a validation method. Next slide, please. So the reason why we're setting up Gen3 for this project is that we are working on the Australian Cardiovascular Disease Data Commons, and that's a big project with all the partners you see on the left-hand side, which are medical research institutes and research organisations in Australia who have collected lots and lots of cardiovascular disease data from lots of different kind of data types, so genomics, lipidomics, metabolomics, demographic, clinical imaging, lots of different data types, but there's no kind of way to bring that all together. So we are setting up this project that has these broad overviews, and we're using Gen3 for that data platform part you see in the middle to bring that data all together with the overall aim to enhance understanding of cardiovascular disease risk and hopefully lead to better health outcomes for patients. Next slide, please. So this is kind of an overview of how we went about our data dictionary development. I'll talk you through it because it's a little bit complicated. But so on the left-hand side, we can see we have our cohorts, and these cohorts were collected for all kinds of different reasons with different data models. And we want to bring them all into a harmonized state so that we can kind of find the data that people are interested in an efficient way across multiple cohort studies. And so this was a pilot project. So we're starting out just with 3 studies. And so once we get into this idea of harmonization, we go up to the top and say, we need to kind of put those fields across these studies into consistent objects, fields, and data types. And you've seen that in Gen3, we do this by defining them in YAML files. But when we started going about this and learning about the process, we found that that could be a bit unfriendly or difficult to do for people not really familiar with YAML files. And also it can be quite prone to making small errors. You need to be quite strict with the way it's structured and the terminology and syntax that's used. So what we decided to do was build a object relational mapper in Python that could model all the different parts of the schemas within a Python library. And then by doing that, we could define all our objects and fields and data types in Google Sheets and use that library to automatically convert a Google Sheet into those YAML files. And then once we had those YAML files, we used a tool that's basically a tool that was developed by the University of Melbourne Cancer Centre for Cancer Research, and use that to go through the process of putting those YAML files into a structural visualization. That tool is helpful because it means you don't have to be running your entire Gen3 stack and updating that to be able to look at your dictionary. It's kind of like a carved off piece that you can kind of play around with, and it's a bit easier to work with. So we use that to like look at our visualization of our graph of our data dictionary. And then once we can see that, we can decide, is this good, or do we need to go back to our harmonization strategy and think about it more and go through this process? Once we're happy with it, we can move on to converting those YAMLs into a JSON file. And we can also generate some simulated data that we can then put into a actual running Gen3 to look at the portal and look at the ETL and the configuration to see if that's kind of giving us what we need in terms of our kind of model and how we want the portal to look. And that could be in kind of your local Docker Compose environment, so that you're not having to push that to production all the time. Again, you go back and check and like, are we happy with this, or do we need to go back and look at it again? Once we're happy, we could then kind of push that into our production environment and make it live with our fit for purpose dictionary and move on. So next slide, please. I'll dig into a bit of detail about some of those things I talked about. So when we wanted to kind of start harmonizing our objects and fields and data types, we tried to focus on 20 to 30 variables. We reached out to the data custodians of the different cohorts because they're the ones that really know what are the important fields, what do they have in their data that they think are going to be useful for finding or searching for data of interest for users. And we engage with them to kind of bring together and settle on the different fields that we wanted to put in and how we would define them within our dictionary. We also looked for Gen3 dictionaries that already existed, and we saw that Biodata Catalyst actually has quite a lot of similar kinds of data because that's developed out of the National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute. So we kind of looked to their structure to also structure our database and also kind of make ours a bit integratable with theirs, because that would be really useful for us in the future. And we also look to kind of align to standards or vocabularies, using ontologies for some of our fields and enumerated values, and also using standardized identifiers such as human metabolome database IDs within our dictionary. Next slide, please. When we were doing this, we based it again around a Google Sheet. We find Google Sheets really useful for promoting collaboration across our partners and making it really easy for everyone to contribute in and share across all the different partners we're working with. You can see here, we kind of looked at some existing international data models. So you can see NHLBI on the left there, and then on the right, you can see the 3 pilot studies, AusDia, BioHeart, and Field. And here, it's just an example of diastolic blood pressure. And you can see each study kind of defines it slightly differently in terms of what they call the field. But by putting it all in one place, we can kind of see, okay, everyone's using the same units. They're using a similar field type, so like they're using numbers. So we can then use all of this information to come up with our harmonized variable that we're happy is capturing the right information across all our studies, and define that to make sure that everyone's happy, and have a note there that maybe we need some information. Or so we've repeated that for all about 20 to 30 variables. Next slide, please. And then when we go into the way we put it from that kind of harmonization process, we had different tabs in our spreadsheet. And so we have a tab that will define our objects. And then next slide, next, this is an animation, yeah. So we have our objects, and then we need to define links to define which objects are linked to each other. Next. Then we have variables for each object. And then the next one is that we'll have some of those variables will have enums. And then one more animation. Yep. And so with all of these different tabs and using our object relational mapping library, we could write a little script that takes all the information that we have in our Google Sheet and converts that into all of the YAML files that we need for the Gen3 dictionary. That link at the bottom is where we have that library. It's all open source and available for people to be used. I'll note that probably no one else has used it. So happy for input and feedback if you're happy to kind of have a go and see if it works for you, and see and contribute to the code in any way. Next slide, please. And so once we have our YAML files, we use this again, this UMCCR dictionary tool that makes that process of testing and validating and compiling to JSON quite simple. And also we can generate simulated data that we can then load into our local install for reviewing the dictionary and reviewing the structure of the dictionary. That image on the right there is what we kind of came up with as our dictionary for the ACDC data portal at the moment. Next slide, please. And then, so we also found it really important to load some simulated data into our portal. As this was a pilot project, we didn't get to the point of putting real data in, but we really wanted to make sure that our data portal was meeting our user needs, and we needed to have some kind of data in there so that it kind of looked and felt like there was real data, so people could have a look and see how it all worked, if they were able to do queries that they were interested in and find the data that they were interested in. And as probably a lot of people know on the call, like each time you're editing your data dictionary, you may need to edit your ETL, you may want to add things to your tabs and filters, and you may need to kind of edit your GitOps configuration. So it was really important to have some data in there to be able to see how it looked in the portal, and see the changes that might need to be made and get that user feedback. And it then also enabled us to kind of test out that ability to link your structured metadata to the actual data files that you wanted to make available through your portal. Next slide, please. In terms of what next, we're really excited. This was a very early stage pilot project, but we've now been awarded more funding to continue this. So we're aiming to get in 18 cohorts and up to around 400,000 individuals into our platform. And so we're going to really be actually able to test out our data dictionary and see how we kind of get that real data into the system. So there's lots of work ahead of us over the next 4 years. And I'm sure we'll have lots of fun trying to get all of that data into the platform. And I think that probably might feed well into the next talk of getting data in. Next slide, please. And just wanted to acknowledge all the people who contributed to the project as a whole from all of these organizations. And next slide, please. And thanks. There's a few contacts on the slide there if you want to reach out and speak to us about any of these tools or anything you want to collaborate on. We're always happy to hear from people. And that's it from me.
Great, thanks so much, Marion. That was very interesting, I'm sure. Well, I myself think it's cool, your tools for visualizing the dictionary, and I think some of our other users probably will as well. So on to the next talk. I want to introduce Irene Perkins, who's going to speak about spreadsheet-based data ingest with Gen3 dictionary-based validation. Turn it over to you, Irene.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings, everyone, and my goodness, what a lot of lovely talks this morning, and especially thanks to Michael, who set the groundwork for talking through the data model. It's a really good lead into my talk here. So if we get to the next slide, I wanted to preface this talk with a little bit of context. So we've created the Aotearoa Genomic Data Repository. So this is a treaty-compliant data archive for New Zealand's Tonga species. And I can't speak enough about that to do it justice. So there's a YouTube video that you can watch with Mick Black from Genomics Aotearoa speaking to it. But in a nutshell, protected species in New Zealand can't be exported overseas without permission. And this also applies to the underlying data. So one of the challenges that we had is, how do we have an onshore data repository that researchers can use to upload and share their data? So this was built in partnership with GA. And with that said, I wanted to go to the next slide and talk a little bit about our motivations here. So Gen3 does have, as you know, it has a data submission portal where you can go and add data to relevant projects. And this is good. It gives feedback as you enter the data. But one of the challenges is that users are typically more familiar with a spreadsheet-based metadata entry. And we had the goal of maintaining a familiar user experience. So here, there's one example. This is from the Sequence Read archive. And if we go to the next slide, there's another example from Geom. And on Geom, you can log in, you can visit a different project, and then you can generate a spreadsheet template. So this guides you through how you can upload how you can record different metadata items. And if you look along the bottom there, there's different tabs for kind of the equivalent idea of nodes. And then it also has a validation. So you can upload this spreadsheet template after you've filled it out. And then if we go to the next slide, there's an example where I've taken that template, I've put in random values, and the validator will tell me all the reasons that that this isn't valid. So it's found one or more errors, and it gives me a summary of the items that I need to correct. And our goal is to replicate this experience. So if we go to the next slide, there's three main punchlines to our goals. We want to accept metadata from a spreadsheet template. We want to validate a spreadsheet against an arbitrary Gen3 data dictionary. We could have approached this maybe from a more simple development perspective, hard code. This is our data dictionary structure. Here's how it's validated. But then we would kind of code ourselves into a corner if we took the easy route, right? Because then that means we wouldn't be able to change our structure, our data dictionary structure later on. As we've just seen in a previous talk, a really lovely example of how you might migrate a data structure. So we want to do this against an arbitrary data dictionary so that there isn't the hassle of going through this exercise again later. And then, of course, we want to provide feedback to the user as we saw with the Geom example. So if we go to the next slide, please. We've created a metadata template, and I presume this was inspired by Geom, although I didn't generate this template myself. That was my colleague Jun He who put this together. But you can see it's really similar. And so the point here is that, well, we can create any template and that's fine. But if we go to the next slide, one of the nice things about this is we can also rename some of the properties that correspond to a Gen3 node. So for example, we found that users were often confused by submitter ID. So submitter ID would be like a unique identifier that you as the researcher put in for a particular node entry. But then it's like, well, who's the submitter? Is it my personal ID? Like, what does it mean? So we actually renamed these in the indicated places so that it's easier to comprehend what the intention of this is. So that was one nice thing of creating our own spreadsheet template. And if we go to the next slide, so the second goal is we want to validate this and we want to use a Gen3 data dictionary because it contains all the information necessary to validate a draft spreadsheet that's submitted by a researcher. So our technical approach, I've summarized it on the next slide. And again, it's kind of 3 steps. So we parse the spreadsheet metadata. That's pretty straightforward because it's just tabular data. And then we parse a data dictionary, which, as we've learned today, is a JSON schema. That's a little bit more involved, and I'll get to that in a little bit. And then we perform a rule application on properties and nodes for validation. So once we read in the JSON schema, that tells us, you know, as a property, is it a string? If it is a string, is there a regex pattern? Is it, sorry, what kind of value is it? And then, so there's property-based validation that's possible, and then there's node-based validation that's possible. So like, what's the multiplicity? Is it 1-to-1, many-to-one? What are the parent nodes? What are the children nodes? Do I have a node that doesn't have a parent? That sort of thing. So that's what I mean by rule application. And that more or less comes for free with the data dictionary parsing, assuming we've designed the tool properly. So next slide, please. I wanted to speak a little bit more about the data dictionary structure. So we've already had that wonderful introduction, but just to point out each of these nodes. So I have example, there's an experiment node. And then if you click on a node, it says how many properties they have. So maybe you have like collection date, and that would be a property within a sample. Next slide, please. So the components of a data dictionary, we already know that there's nodes and properties, but there's also definitions. So definitions can refer to other definitions. So this is, I took this from, I think this is in the UCCDIS GitHub. One example is there's a UUID, a global unique identifier. It's a string and it has a defined regex pattern that we can validate against. And then if we look down on line 15, there's parent UUIDs, and that refers to the UUID definition. So the definition section of the schema is really useful because you can, instead of having to define these over and over, within a node definition, you can refer to this section, and then this section can refer to other definitions within it, and so on. And then if we go to the next slide, there's also terms, and so you can put in descriptions and term definitions, and again, these can live here instead of within individual nodes, and it keeps it a little tidier. So there's a little bit of work to parse through the dictionary because things can point in different directions and you have to go and retrieve them. So that was one little complication. And then continuing on to the next slide, kind of the punchline of this is what's the approach? Well, from our metadata template ingest, we can represent the metadata as a graph. So I can parse a Google Sheet or an Excel sheet. I can put in a graph structure. The data dictionary, as we know, it's already a graph structure, so I can read it in. And then we can combine both of those into a graph structure. So I have my values that are from the metadata template. And then I have the graph structure that I've read in as a data dictionary. And when I put them together, I can take the values and I can apply the rules. And I'm calling it a rule. So what's the definition of a property? And does the value adhere to that or not? And then I can simply generate output like we've seen in Geom. And to get a little bit more technical, the next slide, I have a little snippet from the UML diagram that I created while thinking through this problem. Because if you think about like how would I design this code, it could get out of hand very quickly. But I took a moment to think about it. And if I think about everything in terms of a graph, then I can break that into a schema, which is composed of nodes, and a node is composed of properties. And then I can just subclass that. So I can have a template, which represents my metadata template. I can have metadata, which represents the Gen3 JSON schema. And then I can have a validator, which is just those two things combined. And now the way I'm working through it technically is very simple. And the last few slides I have is I just wanted to show off some of the code snippets from this project. So if you go to the next slide, please. I've implemented this in Python. And if I want to iterate over all nodes, that it's just a breadth first search. And it's very simple. I have a node, I get its children, and then I iterate through the children. And then the next slide, I have an example where if I want to validate a node, I just call the code that I previously showed you. So I can iterate through it. I can just say, I want to walk the graph structure. I call validate on it. Validate, we'll do it at two levels. So like I said, at a node level, does it have a parent? Does it have the right multiplicity? And then at property level, does it have the right regex pattern? If it's an enumerated type, is the value like within the predefined enums? If it's a number, is it really a number? And then once I have that information about whether it's valid or not, I can simply generate a report. So it's just a matter of iterating. And then the last thing I wanted to show, which is my final slide here, is parsing a dictionary. And I have a little note, please excuse the mess, that this can be further simplified. But what I wanted to point out here is the entire code to parse a data dictionary can basically fit on the slide. And while it could be cleaned up a little bit, it's just a bit of recursive thinking. Walk through the nodes and then figure out parent-child relationships. And while I'm parsing a node, I can walk the JSON schema. I can pull out those terms and those definitions, and I can put it in a node, and I can pull out the properties. I have a little comment down below where I say do some post-processing. I didn't have the space to fit it on the slide. It's just a few lines, and it's another walk through the graph to make sure that I have all the parent-child connections set up. So it's pretty straightforward. And the point of my talk here was I wanted to show how we've leveraged the data dictionary to arbitrarily be able to validate a spreadsheet template. So we'll do some testing. And hopefully, when we change our data dictionary structure, we won't have to rewrite any code. Although, if you don't find bugs, then you're not doing testing properly. So touch wood. And so we want to have this tool be reusable and extensible. So maybe some future plans will want to use this to automate creating like a TSV or maybe even JSON for metadata ingest, and both automate data upload, which I know there's support for that, but also include validation that's user-friendly and easy for a researcher to understand and have it match, have a reasonably similar user experience to other tools that they're familiar with. And ultimate goal is to have data ingest be a self-serve process, because at the present moment, when a researcher does data ingest, it's with the assistance of an SE staff member. And my last slide is a thank you to everyone. It's such a wonderful community, and you can find me on the Gen3 Slack.
Thanks so much, Iron. I really think it's great that your talk dovetailed so nicely after Marion's, one on the dictionary and then next on data ingest. So hopefully there's some cool tools that will be available for the community to help them with getting data into Gen3 Data Commons. So the next speaker is Brian Ferner. Welcome from the Data for the Common Good at the University of Chicago. And he will speak about versioning, migrations, and data release processes in the pediatric cancer data commons. Brian.
Thank you, Michael. You can go on to the next slide, please. So I wanted to spend just a few minutes describing our consortium because it plays a bit into a lot into the modeling decisions that we've made as we've gone through, and there are downstream consequences of our modeling choices based off of necessity. So the PCDC is, as this slide here indicates, really a consortium of consortia. And as illustrated here, we've got a number of different independent consortia. So we've got the neuroblastoma consortia, the INRG, consortia for germ cell tumors called MAGIC, one for Hodgkin lymphoma called Nodal, and so forth. And each of these consortia really operates and are governed independently of one another. If we can go to the next slide, please. Right, as a general rule, we have really a consortium for each one of these disease groups, and there's an executive committee and often one or more work groups that are formed by a consortium to carry out specific tasks on behalf of the executive committee. But the overall structure here is that the executive committee really determines the governance for how a given consortium operates. And so they both set the priority in terms of the types of scientific questions that get asked and can be answered by the data. They help convene groups to create individual data dictionaries. They work to prioritize the harmonization of data, as has been pointed out in other talks today. That work can be time-consuming and expensive, and so there needs to be somebody to really set the priorities for that. And that's really what the executive committees tend to do for each of these consortia. And so ultimately they really do fuel the research and discovery that happens and is the real reason for each of these sort of individual consortia to bubble up within the overall pediatric cancer data commons. On the left, we sort of have a number of different cooperative groups listed here, and usually those end up being the folks that contribute data to the pediatric cancer data commons, and they contribute it to the individual consortium, and that individual consortium, and in particular the executive committee of that consortium, is the group that ultimately gives the authorization for the Data for the Common Good, or PCDC group, to actually release data when there is a specific research project that the executive committee approves. So that isn't something that happens at the overall PCDC level. That is something that happens at the individual consortium level. So it really is, in that regard, a consortium of independent consortia. Next slide, please. So it is ultimately a clinical data commons. We have a number of different types of clinical data. A number of them are shown here, for example. But our primary source of data is from completed clinical trials, although increasingly we are getting contributions to the PCDC from registries, and in some cases from the electronic health records system. We link to data in other resources wherever possible, as opposed to trying to bring those data into our commons and duplicate them. And so in cases where we have common identifiers, the link subjects in the PCDC and in other commons, such as the NCI's Genomics Data Commons or the Gabriella Miller Kids First platform, we are able to create linkages to these other commons through those identifiers. Ultimately, the thing that really ties the entire pediatric cancer data commons together is that there really is a single common data model that underpins each one of the consortia that are part of the PCDC. And so as we bootstrap these consortia, we work with them to build their data models or their data dictionaries in a way that builds on the work that has been done by others, much in the way we've seen in prior talks here, where you can pick and choose aspects of models that have already been built or dictionaries that have already been built. In our case, when a new group comes online or is about to come online, the modeling work with that group generally begins from the existing PCDC model, and then it's usually a matter of either winnowing that down to the specific nodes and properties that are of interest to an individual disease group, or in some cases, obviously extending the model to include additional enum levels, additional properties, and in some cases, additional nodes where those are required. But we do, this is really the substrate of the entire PCDC, is this single model that binds this consortium of consortia together. Next slide, please. So here's a really high level version of our model. Currently, the one that we have implemented is fairly sizable. There's 45 nodes and a little over 600 properties currently in there. And this, excuse me, covers, as I was saying, that entire sort of aggregated model across all of those consortia. We not surprisingly inherit the program and project nodes that folks are familiar with from the Gen3 framework. And then from those, we begin with a person node that models essentially a unique individual in the world, and that person can be a subject in more than one research study. They can exist in one or more of those consortia that I was talking about, and definitely they can also exist in data sets from more than one contributor. For example, in the pediatric cancer world, we do see, for example, there will be individual patients that exist in both a children's oncology group study, and that same individual will also be in a St. Jude's Research Hospital data set. And so we needed to be able to address the case where you have a single person in the world that may be a subject on more than one study and from more than one data contributor. They may even be in more than one consortia if subsequently they get a malignancy as a result of their primary primary tumor treatment, they could theoretically wind up also in a completely different consortium. So that is why we have the person and subject broken up like this. Our subject node has attributes that hold the association of that subject to the specific consortium and data contributor that that they came in through, and we use those as again for the purposes of the governance that is set forth by the consortia that we serve. The executive committees need to be able to, at the subject level, be able to provide access to a researcher based off of a subject being essentially governed, a subject's records essentially being governed by that particular consortium's executive committee. Beneath subject, we have a host of observation nodes. A few of them are listed here. These include information about subjects, and they're organized through these nodes that I've shown here just a couple of, and these do end up getting related to the subject through this optional timing node, which is used to essentially group these nodes observations around specific points in time in the disease course of an individual patient. So if they had an initial diagnosis and then relapses and subsequent malignancies, those timing events can, all of the observations surrounding those can be grouped through that timing node. Next slide, please. Getting more into our release processes. So we tend to release on roughly a quarterly basis, and these releases generally include some combination of new and updated records, and not surprisingly, dictionary changes as well. One thing that we do is we version the entire data set, so the entire graph at each release. The way that we handle versioning is really we make use of the project node to handle versions. So each data set version is effectively given a new record in project. So we might have a V1 project record and a V2 project record. When we go to the V2 project record, since person and all of the other nodes sit downstream of that node, there essentially at that point is the necessity for us to effectively reload the entire graph below that, because we really want to be able to preserve this history, excuse me, of the data set as it grows over time. So as a result of this, our loads tend to be quite long. So a full load of our graph takes about a day and a half, and really any corrections that need to be made that come up through the process of loading really can be very, very costly from a timing perspective. If we have to go back and start reloading things, we just know that there's a whole day and a half waiting for us for those changes. Next slide. So continuing in terms of versioning and migration. So, right, we do really want to be able to keep these point in time archival snapshots of our graph, in part because they're extremely useful for troubleshooting data change over time. and also because it may be the case that we get asked by an executive committee or one of the working groups that are part of the executive committee. Well, what was the data? So what did the data set look like, 2 versions ago? And we want to be able to respond to those sorts of questions. And so the easiest way for us to be able to accommodate that was to effectively carry the full data set forward as it evolves. It also allows us to be able to reproduce an analytic data subset at any point in time. So once an executive committee, for example, approves the release of data to an investigator and we create an export for that investigator at some future point in time, if we get updated outcomes data, for example, for some subset of that population, it may be important for us to be able to reproduce an older version of the data set if, for some reason, the investigator that initially was approved to receive that data set just needs another copy of it for whatever reason, or loses access to it, and we need to be able to reproduce that. We don't want to reproduce the data set with updated outcomes. We want to be able to reproduce the data set as it was at the time that it was approved by the executive committee. So just another reason for this need for capturing sort of point in time snapshots of the graph. And while changes to the versions are incremental, again, given the way that we've chosen to go about modeling and because of these other use cases that I've addressed here, we really do need to perform these full loads of data on each release. And to address some of those time constraints, we are really excited to be exploring the use of PFB to support some of those processes. So, for example, to be able to export the entirety of the graph into a PFB, hold those in an archive rather than potentially holding multiple concurrent versions of the graph at any given time in those different, essentially associated to those different project records. So that would be extremely nice from a resource standpoint, not to have to maintain the full data set in concurrent versions within the graph. So that's one reason that we're excited to explore PFB export. And then on the import side, we could leverage that the export to then subsequently do imports either to seed migrations for upcoming releases or back to the use case of being able to troubleshoot data changes over time, having the ability to import a prior export of a previous version into a separate tier to be able to do troubleshooting there. And again, not having to maintain the full data set in multiple versions concurrently would be extremely beneficial for us. So yeah, the PFB is really something that we're very excited about and very thankful to the CTDS group for helping us to troubleshoot issues we've had with that and building out that functionality, which will really help with a number of the operational constraints that we have based off of just our overall use cases. And I actually think that I failed to put in a thank you slide at the end of my talk, so I will say thank you in the absence of a slide to both certainly the CTDS group. It's been wonderful to hear all of these other presentations, and a big thank you to the Data for the Common Good team and the Pediatric Cancer Data Commons Consortium that we serve.
Great. Thanks so much, Brian. That was really interesting hearing about the consortium of consortia model, but also the sort of new features that you're pioneering on the data versioning side. It's great to know you're making some progress there, and I'm sure everybody would like to hear more about that as you make progress there. So with that, well, first I'd like to thank the speakers. First of all, the timing was great, but also for your great insights and work you're doing. So I'd like to turn it over to discussion. I mean, anybody on the line is welcome to put a question in the chat, or speakers can ask questions of other speakers as well. There's no questions. I have one that came to was top of mind. Maybe just because you're just speaking, Brian. But I was curious if you could say any more about the way you're linking patients across projects. I know you talked a little bit about the person node, but is that the mechanism you're using for, you said you were linking to Kids First or GDC, or is there some other way that you're connecting that information?
The way that we do that connection is through the Children's Oncology Group has an identifier for participants called the USI, and that USI is also an identifier that, for example, accompanies the target data in the GDC. And so when we get clinical data from neuroblastoma from the COG, it's also encoded to that USI. So it's through that, essentially that shared identifier, that we are able to link to the GDC, and we're able to link to the Gabriella Miller Kids First. Now, in the case of linking to the St. Jude individual or individuals, that required their being on as brokering services through the Children's Oncology Group, because the St. Jude investigators knew the COG IDs, which they're allowed to have, and their local identifiers, and the COG statistician could then essentially take that COG ID, replace it with a USI, and send that along to us. So yeah, we essentially leverage that common identifier to do most of our linkages. We're not doing anything with privacy preserving record linkage. All of our data tends to be, and by tends to be, I mean is de-identified from a HIPAA perspective.
Okay, got it. Yeah, it's always interesting to know, for me at least, how this is done, since it's always a bit complicated.
Yeah, and I think there was another question
about
no, that's yeah, there's nothing magical about that. The question is, how do we do versioning like I've described if the dictionary changes? Right, that is generally through, just deprecate. I mean, that's one of the many reasons why we're also interested in using PFB export as opposed to keeping multiple concurrent versions, right? Because if there are major changes to the dictionary, that obviously would be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to accommodate. Right now, we do, deprecate some properties and then move fields over to new fields if we have to. But yeah, that is another major motivation for us to not attempt to concurrently hold full data sets, because there's at least I don't know of any elegant way of doing this other than side properties and deprecation buff.
As Brian said very well, PFB is designed for that, and I'm just making a call for the community. Michael put the paper to PFB. We are in the middle of what we're doing, calling PFB in the Lake, which is to make it very easy to import and export PFP so you could keep multiple versions and roll back. And the reason I'm speaking up now is to do a call to the community to sort of engage with us, just as a number of people engaged with us on the Helm charts as that was rolled out. You know, a major reason for these community forum calls is, you know, as Brian said, for data for the common good and all the projects they're doing, there's obviously need for different versions and for maintaining the ability to roll back and things. And so just again, a call, if you want to work with us, I'm sure we could set up some follow-up calls to sort of talk about where we are with the tooling for PFB and how you might get involved.
And I would be certainly happy to follow on with another brief presentation at some point once we've gotten our sea legs in regards to doing this, because I'm sure we will learn some things that might be valuable as well.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Are there any other questions from the listeners, from the attendees, to any of our speakers?
In just a general call, if you have topics you'd like to hear in our next community forum in about 2 months, you know, please send us your suggestions. Yeah,
feel free to type them now or send them after the fact. We haven't settled on a topic yet, although the committee is meeting, I think, next week. So we'll probably be discussing then. So if you can get your feedback in before then, that would be great.
I really want to add my thanks to Michael's thanks to the speakers. I thought each of the talks were really quite useful with a lot of usable material and representing obviously a lot of work by different projects in their own ways that sort of adapt Gen3 to what they need out of it. And so I just want to thank the speakers. They obviously put a lot of time into the talks and it was much appreciated.
Yes, yeah, echo Bob. Thanks so much. I think are sharing. Yes, I wanted to put up the acknowledgements for the speakers and for the Gen3 Forum Steering Committee, who's helping to kind of shape these in advance as we go along.
One quick question. If I had questions relating to the modeling of DICOM in Gen3, I take it that Chris will either look at the MIDRC data model, which I will, and if there are follow-up questions, I take it that Chris is the person to ask. We may at some point in the future have DICOM data that we need to index in some way, shape, or form, and it would be good to understand the pitfalls of certain ways of trying to capture them.
Yeah, and if I can make a comment, Brian, was that you?
Yeah, it was me.
Yeah. I think the important thing about the MIDRC effort, one of the important things about the MIDRC effort is there's the committee that that's doing the data model that Chris mentioned in his talk includes RSNA representatives and ACR, the two largest professional radiologists and research radiologists in the US. And so there's a consensus that created the Gen3 Commons, and given that they're the experts and that there probably is a certain interest in interoperating image data very broadly within Gen3, to the extent that groups can either use that data model or, sort of work with Chris to work with that consensus, I think it'd be useful to sort of agree that Gen3 will do DICOM in a certain way. I mean, it's not that individual commons need to, will always have their own data models, But to the extent that they could agree in the same way we agree generally on how we do BAM files, agreeing to DICOM would be useful. And the reason I mentioned this is just because of the long consensus process that led to this inclusion of DICOM.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I'm painfully aware of the length of the of the consensus process, and especially for these things, if you've convened the experts and you've gotten consensus, yeah, that is something that we should leverage. I really liked the collapsing of all of the disparate modalities down into LOINC terms. I thought that was very, very interesting.
And Michael put a comment that's important. If you have a Gen3 Commons, we'd like to list you. And right now we have a couple categories. We have categories that are, I don't know the right term, but it's part of a sort of the, these are commons that interoperate because they share some operation services from the University of Chicago, the Open Commons Consortium. On the other hand, at the bottom is a very, very important category of data commons that are really operated completely independently, but use some of the Gen3 technology. So I think we want to be sensitive to how each of the data commons that are built using Gen3 want to be listed. So not only let us know if you want to be on the page, but let us know if you want a separate section or other types of descriptions. We want to reflect the community. So if there are particular categories you want us to introduce so you could be represented, let us know. I'll turn it over to you, Michael, to close this off.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Give one final.
And do any of the other organizers want to say any final remarks?
Claire, Stephen, Plumman, anything to add?
No, thanks everyone. It's a really great diversity of talks. Thank you very much.
Completely agree. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Plumman. I think this is really great. Hopefully the community finds this information very helpful. I know Michael is going to be also posting this online, so this could be viewed at a later point as well. But like Bob mentioned earlier, if there's any additional topics that the community wants to discuss, do let us know. And we are going to, make sure that we can include these very important topics for the broader community.
Great, thanks everybody. As Plumman said, I'll be posting these in the next couple of days. Thanks so much, everyone. Take care.
Thanks very much.